So this is our second video for the trip, summarising day 3, 4 and 5. Day 3, we had a day off to do whatever we like, but met up at Spin, a ping pong social club, at night with Bond alum. There we met Molly, a Bond exchange student, and she now works in the Valley in entertainment and event planning for all the big companies, and she had some pretty huge clients. We also saw our friend from Google, Tristan. That was an awesome event, and it definitely embraced the culture of the Valley. It's very, obviously it's innovation right there in a club that people can hang out in and play ping pong, which is so innovative, but that was awesome. And then Thursday morning, we headed off to Stanford, which was the most incredible university I have ever seen. It was like a mini city in itself. Then we went and had a lecture with Professor George Foster, and then off for a campus tour. That was followed by Hacker Dojo, where we had a tour of their old office space and new office space, and also had the opportunity to speak to some of the engineers and what they're working on. Day 5, our last day, we started the day off at VMware and had a tour of their campus, which again was just like a mini city with, I think, 17 buildings and more to come. Followed by Cobalt, which is your perfect example of a startup. That was just probably one of the best experiences of the whole trip for me. Being able to see what it's really like in a startup environment and not just in a fancy office. Our final tour was at Nitro, which was also probably one of the best companies of the tour, being run by an Australian as well. I think the culture was different there even as well. Also, we finished the tour off at a Giants game, and I think that was an awesome way to finish the tour. But yeah, this is our summary of day 3, 4 and 5. So on day 4 after Stanford, we went to Hacker Dojo, which is essentially a collaborative workspace where engineers can rent a space and work together. So I spoke to one of the engineers who's working on essentially becoming the brokerage between venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and matching them. So he came from Microsoft, and he believes that his knowledge of this Valley scene and the people is an asset, and that he has the ability to match people up accordingly. And that was really interesting to see, because we've seen the startups and we've seen from US Mac and heard about the venture capitalists, and to be honest, I'd never even thought of something like that. So it was cool to see the next step maybe in the Valley. Also, we spoke to another man who was working on a platform for after school activities and sign-ups, and he made a really interesting point, saying that people in the Valley and in Hacker Dojo aren't too worried about protecting their product, because they believe that it doesn't matter if you both have the same idea, it's all about execution and who can do it better. So I think Hacker Dojo was a cool experience to see engineers actually working in the space, and also their new space, which looked awesome. So our first stop on day 5 was VMware, and the first thing that really struck me here was all about their culture. So their epic culture is the first thing he mentioned, which is about execution, passion, integrity, customers, and community. And I think the first thing that really struck me about this was the execution, in terms of how they've built their site using so many recycled materials and having fresh air. That was extremely interesting to hear. We haven't heard any of these companies talking about how green they are. So I think execution and their attention to detail and how they created their workspace was really interesting. Also, in terms of community, how it's a child and dog friendly workplace, I think that really changes the dynamics and makes it a more casual and community based workplace. Also, their Friday bash and the other events he was speaking about, that sounded awesome. So I think the community culture at VMware was one of the most unreal and extremely different things that we've seen in the Valley. The other thing about VMware that really struck me was the low power distance. He was talking about how the CEO walked past him one day, knew him on a first name basis, and thanked him for the work that he does. And I think that's a really special thing that a company can have. So that was definitely a main takeaway for me.
On day 4, we went to Stanford University and listened to Professor George Foster present several ideas on innovation and entrepreneurship. The first idea that he presented was fairly universal across the several companies that we visited throughout the week, and that was that Silicon Valley tolerates smart failure, which you can learn from. The second definition that I thought was quite interesting was that where he defined luck is when the opportunity meets capability. Now, this is fairly consistent with what we heard in Hacker Dojo, whereby all the engineers accepted and were open to sharing their idea because they knew that it was to do with your ability to execute the idea rather than the idea itself. And I thought that was really interesting compared to Australia's ideologies, where it's all about protecting your idea. Now, another point that George brought up was it's incredibly important to develop an understanding of how to identify waves. Now, the biggest problem within venture capitalists nowadays is attaching an idea to a wave that's larger than the idea itself. So, for example, a bad idea can be viewed so largely and in such a macroeconomic perspective that it can be attached to any overarching wave. And that's a danger in venture capitalist society right now. And another point that he brought up was that too much of venture capitalists and growth is focused on accelerating the idea and not scaling. Now, last but not least, George Foster brought up the idea that entrepreneurs keep coming back with the plan. And most entrepreneurs nowadays believe that ideas should be built and then measured and then implemented into an opening that's already identified. However, George Foster feels like there should be a third step into that methodology whereby you learn and iterate based on your failures. So you build, measure, learn, and repeat until you find the appropriate opening for the market space. And those were pretty much the main takeaways that I got from Stanford. The next company that we went to was Cobalt, which is a very early startup in its design phase, just got some funding from a venture capitalist and has just moved into an office. And it was really interesting to see essentially what all the fuss was about. The entire week we met with venture capitalists and accelerator programs and established companies, and they all talked about how important the startup phase is and how important it is determining where you're going to head in the future. And it was really interesting to see how companies actually begin. And one of the key main takeaways that I got from the experience was meeting in their office and how adaptive they were in the early stage. I remember when we were listening to their presentation, they were constantly adapting things throughout our presentation and identifying things that they need to change to stay competitive. So those are essentially my main takeaways from that experience. The final company that we went to was Nitro, which was a relatively established company which focuses on document visualization and editing. The key main takeaways that I got from Nitro were its culture and its innovation throughout the company. It was one thing to hear that companies have established culture throughout their organization, but it was another thing to see. So we went there on a Friday, and they all talked about how they're allowed dogs in the office, and the beer cart comes around every afternoon. But it was another thing to see that all the employees enjoyed being there on the Friday afternoon instead of heading out. And so that really proved to me and made my eyes open to the fact that employees actually do appreciate the culture in the company. Now, one main takeaway that I got from Nitro was its innovative idea that it recognized that so many individuals came and interviewed for positions there, and it was innovative enough to make its front desk a bar instead of its reception. And it identified the fact that people would recognize that it was a bar, and they would tell their friends and colleagues of like, look how cool Nitro is, and that would generate word of mouth feedback saying how good the company is. So I really thought the small, intricate, innovative ideas such as that were really key to the culture of Nitro, and those are my main takeaways.